Okay, so I'm getting the green light. I think we're ready to get started here. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Marshall, and I'm the head of exhibitions and programs at the George Eastman Museum. Welcome to tonight's virtual panel discussion about trans representation in cinema. We are thrilled to be joined by our very prestigious panelists, Zachary Drucker and Susan Stryker. Chase Joint was scheduled to be joining us, but unfortunately something came up last minute, which is preventing him from participating, but we'll carry Chase's spirit with us throughout the evening. This conversation is a collaboration with the Rochester LGBT Film Festival, ImageOut, and is being moderated by the festival's film programmer, Michael Gamilla, who I'll turn things over to in just a minute. The catalyst for tonight's conversation is the exhibition To Survive on This Shore, Photographs and Interviews with Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Older Adults, which is now on view in the Eastman Museum's Project Gallery through the end of December. For over 5 years, photographer Jess T. Dugan and social worker Vanessa Fabbre traveled throughout the United States seeking individuals whose experiences exist within the complex intersections of gender identity, age, race, ethnicity, sexuality, socioeconomic class, and geographic location. Dugan and Fabbre moved from coast to coast to big cities and small towns, documenting the life stories of transgender and gender nonconforming older adults, an important but largely underrepresented population. Within the project, each of Dugan's photographs is accompanied by an excerpt from a full-length interview conducted by Fabbre. These texts give insight into each individual's lived experience, enhancing the viewer's connection to each subject's story. The exhibition provides a nuanced view into the struggles and joys of growing older as a transgender person, and offers a poignant reflection on what it means to live authentically despite seemingly insurmountable odds. Now, it may seem like cinema, the subject of today's conversation, is a bit of a departure from a photography exhibition, but at the core, both are about images and stories which ultimately impact our perception of others and our understanding of the world. And for those of you who are unaware, in addition to being a museum of photography, we are also a museum of moving images with a 500-seat art house theater that thankfully is back to screening films 5 nights a week. And before we get started, I would like to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, Trillium, for tonight's panel, as well as their support along with Matt Haig and Bill Schaefer and the Schaefer-Haig LGBTQ Advocacy Fund, and an anonymous donor for their support of this To Survive on This Shore exhibition. The support is immensely valuable in order for us to have these types of meaningful and important conversations and exhibits. We're going to be doing something a little different tonight from our typical programs. Instead of doing, oh, there's Dale. He's gonna probably pop in and say hi a few times. We're gonna be doing something a little different tonight from our typical programs. Instead of doing questions only at the end, we'll be fielding them throughout the conversation. So if you have questions at any point during tonight's program, please submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be answering as many of them as we can get to. We are recording tonight's webinar and we'll be putting it on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So if you'd like to go back and watch again or share with others, you'll be able to access it along with our other webinars and video content through YouTube. We have, I will turn the closed captioning function on Zoom on momentarily. So we will be providing closed captioning. If you do not want the closed captioning on your screen, you do have the ability to turn it off by clicking on the CC icon. There should be a way to toggle it off. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael Gamilla. Michael.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Nick, for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion. Very exciting. As Nick said, I'm the programming director of ImageOut. And tonight we have 2 important panelists with us. We have Susan Stryker, who's a professor emerita from the University of Arizona, and she's going to be our resident historian in this panel. We also have Zachary Drucker, who is an independent artist and producer, and now also filmmaker. You probably would know her from, if you watch Transparent, because she was one of the producers of of the show, and she just had her film The Lady and the Dale premiere at HBO earlier this year. So welcome, Susan and Zachary.
Thank you so much for having us. We're thrilled to be here.
I have to admit,
for both of us, Susan.
I have to admit, when I was first invited to this discussion, the first thing that came to mind was I knew I saw the trans representation in cinema, but the first thing that came to mind is the lack of representation of trans community in cinema. So I was going through through tonight's panel discussion with that in mind, and that it's only this morning that I actually realized it's just trans representation in cinema. But you know, we've gone a long way to have LGBTQI plus represented in cinema and in TV, and I feel like the trans representation is you know it's towards the end of it, not the end, but as always it's behind, along with representing queer people of color. There's still a lot of that is wanting. So I guess just to get into the topic for tonight, in your opinion, what is the state of trans representation in today's cinema? And I'll include TV because that medium has a lot more reach when it comes to reaching out to people.
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in and say, and I'll be a little bit of a contrarian, you know, to some of the things that you had said at first, Michael, that you know, when I look as a historian back at the history of cinema as well as the history of television, I see a lot of trans representation. It's not always good representation, but like from the very beginnings of the media, you know, from the beginnings of television, the beginnings of cinema, even the beginnings of photography, people whose sense of self and expression of gender seems, you know, transgender, gender variant, what have you, have been, you know, have been things that image makers have been curious about, and that we can go back and find images, you know, from you know, back into the 19th century. There's a really great film that Zachary and I were both involved with called Disclosure, Trans Lives on Screen, directed by Sam Feder, produced by Laverne Cox, that gets into some of that history. What I think has changed, and Zachary has been a big part of this change, I have to say, is that there are more people with trans and gender variant life experience who now have platforms for telling more complicated stories about trans lives. And the media doesn't just sort of reproduce what I would say like ignorant, low information or stereotypical versions of trans life. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Zachary.
You know, I'll just add to Susan's remarks that, you know, representation is the tip of the iceberg. It's the thing that we see, but underneath that should be a whole structure that reflects what we're seeing on screen. And it's crucial that people, you know, behind those representations, behind the authoring of those representations are included. I think that's kind of like the big project right now in entertainment, is creating pipelines for people to have access to the, you know, the pretty solid employment opportunities in filmmaking and television. Television is way ahead of film, and that's just because of financing. It's a reality that it's easier to finance, you know, a pilot for $1 million than it is to finance an epic feature film for $80 million. And so there's much more representation in television, but it's by 3 people, basically. It's like there's 3 primary creators of shows in which the majority of LGBTQIA characters are on screen. I think we do have a long way to go, but that 2020 was an inflection point, and that in the industry, I think that there is real movement happening in mentoring and training folks who've always been on the periphery, always been excluded from the authoring of their stories. And we've come a long way in a short amount of time. I think progress happens alongside opposition, however, and like over the past few decades, you know, trans people have been increasingly in the spotlight and in the center of the conversation. And of course, that's a moving target. A few years ago, it was bathrooms, and now it's, you know, pediatric treatment of gender affirming care for kids with gender dysphoria. It's school sports for you know, trans children. And in a few years, it's going to be something else. You know, I'll also add just that culture precedes political change oftentimes, and the work that we do in creating these representations does impact legislation eventually. It usually takes 10 years or so. But you can kind of see that in the scope of film and television history, that, you know, the cultural work is done. It changes people's hearts and minds, and they become more open to creating a more egalitarian society. You know, it's hard to hate up close. It's hard to you know, persecute somebody once you know their story and have a way in. And yeah, I'm so grateful. It's been such a wonderful opportunity to witness this moment that I never anticipated happening in my lifetime.
Both you and Susan mentioned so many things that I could, you know, take off from, and I just want to make sure I don't forget some of them. Just going back to what Susan said about representation, that, you know, trans people have always been there, and I do agree, and it might not be all positive, at least not be all positive, but I also feel like the important part of what you said earlier about now the trans representation is more authentic. I think before there's just a lot of gender cross-dressing because people don't know any better, I guess. And I think it's also important. Language, I also think is very important. Now there's a rich language for the trans community and the different trans experiences. Whereas before, people cannot label who they are or what they're experiencing. So sometimes it's very difficult to advocate when you don't have a term for it. But going back to what Zachary said, I think among the LGBTQ plus community, the trans experience is probably the most difficult to capture, just because there's so many flavors and colors to it, especially when people start confusing gender and sexuality, then it gets even more confusing for them. So I guess my question is, do you think trans representation in movies and films should aim more towards educating the mainstream public, or probably to provide role models for trans youth, or both? I guess you can do it both, but I guess it's the people behind the scenes who, you know, you sometimes question their motivation. But I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, you know, I think, I mean, of course, media can have a pedagogical role. It's like it can teach people about things. And I think it can also be useful in holding up examples of, a life that you could aspire to, But I think maybe even the deeper, I don't want to say capacity or benefit, or like what excites me most about transmedia making right now is that I think we can actually tell a lot more complicated stories. It doesn't have to be, necessarily like we only want to tell the story of what it's like for somebody to transition, or we don't necessarily want to tell the story of like the exemplary figure who is like, holding the, trans flag and marching at the front of the parade. It's like that you want to tell stories that have heart and complexity, might even be a little bit messy. Ms. Zachary, I know I've talked about this a lot, working together on her show, the Lady in the Dale, because the main character in that story, Liz Carmichael, was just messy AF. It's like, and yet it is a complicated, compelling story that like lets people have, I think, a much better sense of what trans life can be like. So that, to me, like that's the most interesting work happening in transmedia making right now. It's like telling those like real gritty, compelling, messy stories of actual trans lives. So yeah, that's where my interest is right now.
I couldn't agree with you more, Susan. I think that I was really influenced by new queer cinema of the 90s, which was very anti-role model. I don't know, when you think about the protagonists in Greg Araki films, for example, The Living End, or Nowhere, or Poison, or
Close
Trick,
to the Knives, or yeah.
Mm-hmm. All those. There was a real counterculture then that was like compelling and sexy and relatable. And in some ways there was, I'm sure, an aspirational quality to that, of wanting to be an adult, being a young person and watching those films and wanting to be an adult, to be bad and to be, a human in the world. But I relate much less to role models, as it were, or to the kinds of like, I think sometimes it's harder to access in a way. And I think there's a tremendous amount of pressure on cultural creators to do educational work, to kind of get everybody up to speed. But I also feel like there's something about speaking to your enabling audience, the people who really understand your vernacular, who understand your cultural references, who understand the experience. A great example of that this year was Tori Peters' book, Detransition Baby, which is like, my mom read it and she had to Google certain things. She had to Google, bug chasing and Grindr and all these things that were very specific cultural, words and terms. But somehow the more specific we are, the more universal it is. And if we're speaking to people who really understand, I think the audience outside of that comes along for the ride, even if they don't understand all of it. And that there's something mildly alienating when you're too didactic and really spelling things out for people, that it's not quite as entertaining. And then I have that experience all the time as an American, as a white person, in my subjectivity of watching things that expose me to other cultural experiences. And I'm always thankful for that, for having that view, for being kind of a part of the network that changes, the network of the film or the TV show. So I think there's a tremendous amount of value in telling the stories that we really feel captivated by, and following that intuition. You know, I am led by things that I don't immediately understand. You know, I'm led by things that I feel like I have to find the value. Yeah.
So I just to follow up on what Susan said, I agree that the trans films that we see now are far more interesting because it's not just about transitioning and the surgery, and which fascinated people before, or you know, about activism, but there's a lot more stories that are just about trans people living their lives, you know, either romance and romantic comedies, or drama, family drama and all that, where sometimes it's not even necessary to mention about that they're trans stories because it's just so natural. And as a film programmer, I see that a lot of those stories happening. I guess my next question, talking about trans media makers, how important is it for you to have trans stories be told by trans people? Or do you think the priority is just to have the trans stories out there for people to learn from?
Well, you know, what I think is that trans stories need to be told with trans people. You know, that if it's just somebody who has no connection to trans lives and communities, imagining what they think trans means, it's kind of like, it's going to be shallow because it's not going to be rooted in the complexities of actual lives. But does that mean that somebody who's not trans can't do a good job? It's like, no, of course not. I mean, that somebody could be a great director or actor or, you know, scriptwriter who does not have trans experience, but like they get it at some level because they're in conversation with trans people, you know? And so it's not just only trans people can talk about trans things, but I think anybody talking about trans things needs to be in conversation with trans people, and that lived experience needs to be centered, and it needs to be informing whatever is happening. But, you know, I've got plenty of, you know, cisgender friends and colleagues who, you know, pay attention and I think get it right and do a good job and go about that work with integrity. So I don't like to be in the language police role, even though I often appreciate being in the let me give you the 411 about something.
So a question came in, and I know that when you all see me, you know that means I'm here for business.
Okay.
So a question came in from one of our attendees. They said, I've been having a lot of cognitive dissonance hearing detransition baby read in audiobook version by a cis woman actress. Do you think that dissonance follows the same problematics as having trans actors and actresses playing trans parts? Do you think audio has a special role in representation?
What a thoughtful question. That's a fabulous question. And it's such a nuanced question as well. There's a few things floating around in my mind. To Michael's point first, I think that the transition narrative is the kind of first step in a way. It's like the coming out narrative in gay representation. And I hope that we've moved beyond that at this point. And I also think, to Susan's point, that for so long, transness, it was never really quite represented. It was like cross-dressing, or it was like a cross-gender experience, but it had nothing to do with the lived experience of actually being transgender. It was just a plot device, usually. It was about a man masquerading as a woman to murder Angie Dickinson in an elevator, or to
get cheap housing.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that was
Bosom Buddies,
Some
Tom
Like It Hot.
Hanks.
Bosom Buddies, yeah.
Yeah.
I just, that's so funny you mentioned Bosom Buddies. I just saw that clip about. And then we get to, I mean, we're in a, I would say like a more advanced stage of having these conversations about who's telling the story, who's representing a trans experience on screen, and the cognitive dissonance of, you know, if this boy's articulating a trans experience. It's an interesting choice for sure. I'm not an essentialist. I actually believe that everybody is trans in the sense that we've all had past lives and they probably have not been exclusively in one gender category or the other. And I know that not everybody believes that, but I think that like we're certainly a blend, each one of us, of masculine and feminine energies. Some of the feminist women I know have very masculine characteristics in their personalities and their attitudes and their ways of presenting or being. I mean, I can think of so many men who are very feminine in certain ways, not outwardly, and vice versa. So many women who are, you know, assertive and pugnacious and you know, bossy and all the things that you would typically associate as masculine qualities. So I think I'm much more anarchistic or porous when it comes to who's creating representation. And when I was teaching, there was a lot of students kind of regulating each other and who was allowed to say certain things because they were trans or non-binary and others weren't. And I would always stop them and say, you don't really know who's trans and who's not, and you will never know. There are going to be people in life that you're going to meet who don't read, you know, who either have transitioned a long time ago and you're not perceiving them as trans, or who privately identify as trans and don't present that way or don't talk about it and might only tell a handful of people in their lifetime or take it to their grave, God forbid. And that you can't regulate an internal experience, and you know that everybody's having. As a photographer, as somebody whose background is in photography, I also shout out George Eastman Museum as a space where I, you know, explored the rich history of photography. But there's always this conversation in photo history about the gaze of the outsider, of, you know, the camera as a tool of colonization, as a tool of power, as an extension of a colonizing force. And I think that really dominated photography discourse in the 20th century, but there was a counter argument, which is that there is an advantage to being an outsider and seeing things objectively and noticing things that folks from inside of the community have naturalized into their consciousness and don't recognize. And that said, as an insider, the perspective is completely different because you understand the nuances and subtleties of, you know, what separates us and what unifies us. So I do think that this is, you know, complex territory. I love complexity. Complexity does not have to be complicated, but I know that Tori is a fan of mixing signals and creating layers. And so I didn't hear that it was a cis woman reading the book until now, and it's an interesting choice for sure. ideally, in the future, there's less of a binary. And it's not as much of a thing who's playing who, because, you know, maybe we'll have liberated ourselves from those constraints.
Yeah, but to jump in there, it's like I love what you had to say there, Zachary, about there's like new conditions for new social conditions for representation to be taking place within, and that this idea of like, oh, a trans author's novel about trans people and those who love them being read by a cisgender voice actor in an audiobook. It's like, that's not something that we've spent a lot of time, you know, figuring out, because we haven't had a lot of opportunities to do that, you know. And I think back about you know, our mutual friend Reese Ernst, you know, who made that film a couple of years ago, Adam, who, you know, like, he got some blowback for it, because it's kind of like, wait, you know, it's like, you're a trans guy, you're supposed to be making a movie about a trans guy, but you're making a movie about a cis guy who's pretending to be a trans guy, and that's messed up. And I think his perspective was like, no, this is a trans perspective on something. It's like, this is like trans eyes for the cis guys. It's like, it's a trans take on the world. And it's like, I can look at anything that I want to look at as a trans, you know, you know, storyteller and image maker. You know, but it was like a new situation for receiving representation by the audience of people I don't think were quite prepared for that, maybe. And so this question, which, you know, I do think it's a great question about detransition baby. It's like, well, I hear the thing about cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance can sometimes be useful, you know, like it unsettles you. And, you know, like, then maybe ask questions like, well, are they reading the story in a way that conveys some sense of like bad attitude towards the work, or the maker of the work, or the characters in the work? Or would this be like, say, like me reading aloud African folk tales at a story hour in the library? It's like, that's not my culture, but I think they're cool stories and I'm conveying them to an audience. You know, is it the same thing to say that the reader of someone else's work is representing it in the same way that an actor on screen would be playing a character who's different than what their life experience has been? You know, it's I don't have any easy questions or easy answers. I think the questions are great, and I hope that the conditions of being able to receive more complicated questions and dwell on them will be something that helps, you know, deepen the conversation about what gender means and does in the present.
And just to add to that quickly before Nick asks the next question, when I first heard the question, which was very good, actually very thoughtful, I thought there's power in hearing your voice. But then again, who's to say what voice is that? Does that mean that we're trying to stereotype what the trans voice is and all that? So you know, my knee-jerk reaction was, yeah, it should have been a trans speaker probably, but does it really matter in the end, as long as the story is out there and understood by people? Anyway, Nick.
Yeah, so I think Susan answered this question to some degree, but I'm still going to ask it since it came in. But maybe the way that it's worded will trigger some more kind of thoughts. When we talk about representation, it seems it's often treated as synonymous with visibility. Though those aren't necessarily the same. Wondering if the panelists could speak a bit to the line between those two ideas as they relate to on-screen stories. Would trans representation extend to trans actors playing cis roles, or are we talking more specifically about representation or trans-specific roles in documentary stories?
Well, you know, I'll just say, maybe to dodge the question a little bit and pass the mic over to Zachary, you know, that I think the more range we have for telling different kinds of trans stories, the less difference it makes as to whether or not a trans person is playing that role. Or like maybe to like clarify that, it's like if you think about most trans media representations being about transition, you know, if you're talking about a trans person, you've got the casting problem of either finding a trans person who is an actor who is actually going through transition, and you like key your production to like their actual physical social transition, or you hire a cis actor to like play the person before they transition as well as after they've transitioned, or you hire a trans person to then like try to like pass as cis, you know, for like the earlier parts of the story. And so like if you're focused on just the transition story, it really foregrounds the problem of casting. But if you're telling a story that just happens to involve a trans person and it's not necessarily about their transition, you know, just like there's no reason to not cast a trans actor to play that role, and it makes casting a trans person in that role more problematic. On the other hand, if you're talking about a trans person in their pre-transition or early transition life, it's like, well, you know, it's like, I don't think it matters quite so much if you're casting a cisgender person in that role. And so all of which is to say that just like, I think it's messy and complicated, and that while you want to avoid you know, what you might call drag face performance, you know, or like casting, inappropriately casting cisgender people as transgender people. It's like, that's what you want to avoid. But, you know, given that transgender is at some level about changing, moving across gender categories and gender expressions and embodiments over the course of your life, it's like, I think there can be opportunities for cisgender actors to play trans lives in some ways, you know? And then of course you get into other kinds of questions about, you know, race blind or gender blind casting. Like that can be a completely legitimate aesthetic choice. You know, it can be a different style of representation. So yeah, so I'll just leave it at that.
These are such astute questions, by the way. I love Rochester. Everyone is so heavy. I am from Syracuse, New York, nearby. And I've been to Rochester a few times as an adult, as well as a young person. Yeah, I mean, I think whenever there's such real obstacles for trans talent to get a foothold in the industry, and that you know, being on a name show, you know, recognizable show, just makes all the difference in the world. Once you have that on your resume, it's kind of a path to get cast in more things, and ultimately it's that first gig that really is your kind of test of viability. And, you know, I think after that, it's much, from a casting perspective, it's easier to create, you know, to justify hiring somebody. So I'm always in favor of, you know, just offering roles to trans actors to have that opportunity. And I think there's so many basic roles and scripts that don't have to be cisgender people. And then at the same time, I think there's tremendous value in walking in the shoes of a trans person, for anybody. And that cinema, you know, creating a world is a rare opportunity, you know, sometimes for people to be able to walk in the shoes of transness. And yeah, I see a future where these notions of gender are just much more porous. And I'm really thankful for our lexicon, for the fact that we've been able to name things that we didn't have names for before, that we've found ways to identify that are expansive and individualized and unique. And yet, underneath all of that is our shared humanity. And it's always been my kind of personal style, I think, to just put that at the front and let my transness fall to the back, you know, to not always kind of make that the first line of defense or the first thing, you know.
Actually, that was my follow-up question. That question from one of the listeners about cisgender actors playing trans roles. And I'm glad that both of you have a more liberal approach to it, because there are some people who are really like anti allowing cisgender people to play trans roles. I did watch Disclosure, and there was something in the documentary that Laverne Cox mentioned about when trans actors play trans roles, and then you see them um, in their everyday lives as trans people. There's a certain power in seeing that representation, because then it becomes more than just having good makeup and good wig, which was the case for, you know, some of the award-winning trans performances that we've had in recent years. So that made me think, when I heard her say that, that made me think that, you know what, there's a lot of thought in that statement. So I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Yeah, that's a good point, you know, and I like the sort of the flip side of that point that Jen Richards made in the film about, like, when audiences see a character who's supposed to be a transgender person and they go like, oh, that's Dustin Hoffman playing a woman, that's Robin Williams playing a woman, or that's, you know, Jeffrey Tambor playing a woman. It's like that it kind of puts in their mind that, like, trans women are just men in dresses, you know, because they know the man, right? And so to show people on screen like Jen Richards herself, who's just like is a trans woman 24/7, 365, it's just like she's just a trans woman playing a character on TV, you know. And I think there's a tremendous power in that, of like people seeing actual trans folks just being folks doing whatever it is that the character that they're playing is supposed to be doing. It's like, for me, like, that is one of the biggest shifts that's happened in recent years.
And I want to get to this before it gets any later, because this was a Chase question, and unfortunately Chase is not able to join us. We see a lot of representation of trans women right now in media, but I think trans masculine experience is still lagging way behind as far as the representation. I just want to ask what your thoughts on that are.
I mean, I think we have, a lot of work to do when it comes to representing the entire spectrum of trans experience. I think that we've gotten a start, basically, and it's sort of like one show at a time, and it's happening, you know, somewhat rapidly. But in representing trans masculinity, it's the Wild West still. There's still, I think, a lot of work to do. And I don't know, you know, Susan, you might have thoughts about why there's more visibility around trans femininity. I think that there's an element of glamour, fashion, that women are on display in this kind of visual culture that we're in, and that it's a patriarchal system. It's, you know, just misogyny is just completely pervasive. It affects trans women and cis women. It affects all women. It affects all men. It's a structure that we have to navigate. And it's one in which, you know, women are visible, scrutinized, pilloried, humiliated, all of that. And that men have a kind of neutrality, a kind of invisibility, you know, that's
Yeah, you know, I agree with that. You know, I think that misogyny is actually at the core of both the overrepresentation of trans femininity and the underrepresentation of trans masculinity. You know, that in mainstream society, it's like, you know, men are valued more than women, and there's like more freak out and anxiety and fascination and titillation with somebody that the cisgender imagination wants to say, that's a man who's being feminine. It's like, and you know, they lose their minds over that. But just like there's not the same cultural pressure, the same level of care, you know, concern. You know, it's like on the one hand, it's like I do think that people assigned female at birth who live as women have a greater range of allowable gender expression. You can wear pants or a dress, you know, you can have long hair or short hair, but it's like male gender codes, I think, are far more rigid, and they come with like far more social cost for transgressing. So I think in mainstream media, it's just like there is a heightened level of fascination about trans femininity and an undervaluing of trans masculinity as an interesting story to tell. But I think it's actually the reverse in a lot of, you know, so-called queer media production. It's like trans femininity is like drag queens who are really men, or it's about, you know, former butches, transmasculine people transitioning towards masculinity. It's like that there is actually, I think there's better representation of transmasculinity in subcultural venues and media works than there is in mainstream society. I mean, there's like so many great films, I think, about transmasculine people that like started out and, you know, I mean, let's just call it like a gay and lesbian context, and that, I mean, like even something like, you know, the L Word, you know, which, you know, whether you loved it or hated it, you know, and thought Max is well done or not well done, it's like, you get that representation there. Or yeah, well, I'll just stop at that. You know, I think it's complicated. I agree that transmasculine representation it needs to be beefed up. I wish Chase was here to talk about it. If y'all haven't seen his new film, No Ordinary Man, about Billy Tipton, it's fantabulous, and it just got a U.S. distributor oscilloscope, and it's rolling out, I think, this month into theatrical release.
I think July.
July, okay, almost this month. It'll be this month next week.
We featured his film in our spring edition, and it's very, you know, I can talk about this later, but I was surprised at the reception it got. And I'm happy to say for Rochester that his film, No Ordinary Man, is actually coming back at the Little Theater, one of our art cinema. So I would congratulate him if he were here tonight, but he's not. But I would encourage people to go see it if you want to see more transmasculine representation on screen.
Yeah.
I'm gonna. Oh, go ahead, Zachary.
I'm just gonna say it's so crazy. I mean, it's a feat. It's like a huge. I mean, that idea of like a trans documentary playing in theaters. I can't recall a broad U.S. release for something so particular to the trans experience. I think that it's a great measure of the progress that trans cultural production has made. What are you going to say, Nick?
Oh, I was just going to say, Jess, Dugan actually had a question for you that came in through the Q&A. And Jess asked, Zachary, having been so intensely involved in the making of films and TV shows, and being an active part of changing the industry to be more inclusive of trans folks, both on set and on crew. What kind of thoughts do you have about the back end of TV and cinema production? From the outside, it seems that things have changed significantly, but I have to imagine it can still be an uphill battle. In short, what are your thoughts about the current state of the industry, and are you excited about where it's headed?
I feel like the culture itself, we're all navigating advanced capitalism, and it's ruthless. It has no regard for individuals, and certainly navigating an industry like Hollywood, which is staunch and arcane in many ways, is brutal. There's a brutality to it that is very conspicuous, very kind of insidious as well. Like it's and hard to really call out a lot of the time when you are navigating the spaces. I mean, I've been, I think, as graceful as I can be in those circumstances, knowing that it's not personal, knowing that I am not reliant or dependent on these structures, and that like I can take them or leave them and be an artist. I mean, I identify primarily as an artist, and I think that that's always given me a feeling of freedom, of not being beholden to managers and agents and a whole coterie of people who are, making money off of my labor. And those are, personal decisions that I've made to just have a sustainable trajectory. The project I'm working on currently is really, I think what is underneath it is that this culture will roll over you. Like this culture will destroy you if you let it, and if you internalize the kind of relentless messages that you have to improve yourself infinitely, that you're never good enough. So I think having a little bit of an irreverent attitude has always been helpful. And it's interesting. Like, I'm not gonna say that it's a walk in the park, but it's certainly been worth it. And I think that great privilege comes with great responsibility. I feel so blessed to have had the opportunities that I've had, and with them comes, I'm kind of really, I hold myself to a standard of ethical responsibility. And it's really, truly a collective effort. And it takes all of us doing this work simultaneously and for the rest of our lives to push this forward. And we're not going to see the end of it either.
Can you tell us a little bit about the project that you're currently working on? Is it?
It's about a microcosm in the early 2000s of fame and celebrity, and it looks at a few particular characters, some of whom were like casualties of the era, and ultimately it seems like the body doesn't forget, that we kind of hold on to our pain and our trauma, and we do whatever we can to continue moving through life. But oftentimes we just get increasingly jaded by time. And I think the trick is figuring out how to be impervious to it, how to like maintain your childlike wonder and curiosity, and to let all the heaviness just fall off of you. But I think also when you're making things, you're always struck by different things that are universal and big. And that's the thing I'm stuck on right now.
I want to piggyback a question to the earlier question about the behind the scenes and the production. As a film festival person, I still find it difficult to market trans films, whether it's narrative or documentary. And there's so many great trans films out there, especially coming from all parts of the world. And in my opinion, sometimes there are years when the best films are, you know, the top 5 films will be trans films. But it's still, I, I still think that there's some difficulty in marketing trans films. And do you think we're still trying to find the audience for trans films, for trans cinema?
You know what I would
Sometimes
say is,
even the trans community don't come out unless you're in San Francisco. Even the trans community don't come out for the films, and I don't know why.
you know, I do think there can be a misperception, not saying that this is what you do, but there's a misperception that like trans films are only for trans people. So like, how do you find the trans people to like put their butts in the seats? But I think any well-told story, it's like, will find its audience, you know, and that's, you know, I was talking with an academic colleague a few months ago who said that she had been on the jury for a film festival in India that, you know, wasn't a queer film festival at all. It was an Indian film festival, but that 8 of the top 10 films in the festival looked at the life of Hijra people, you know, and that it's just like, well, like that was just what seemed like an interesting story to tell, and that the best stories happen to revolve around those kinds of characters because of the kinds of issues that the film could represent. So yeah, I just think, you know, I look at well, I say like look at Zachary's, you know, The Lady in the Dale. It's like so many people have seen that film that like they're interested in true crime. It's like they're not interested in trans stories, and it's just like they just found it a cool story. So I think increasingly that's what trans stories are doing. They're breaking out of niche markets, and that they're finding wider audiences precisely because you know, I think trans issues have become one of the sort of hot button, front and center, frontline struggles of our times. You know, that they've been particularly sort of energized by, I think, being targeted by like right-wing, reactionary, you know, populist movements like, you know, Trumpism in the US and, you know, similar kinds of things in other countries, that trans issues are somehow, you know, imagined as, you know, antithetical to like, you know, traditional cultural values and therefore must be attacked. And other people are going like, no, wait a minute, you know, I don't know if I feel that way. It's like, and so like, there's just a lot of juice around trans issues right now. And I think it becomes a, you know, I think trans issues are like touchstones for these much deeper cultural questions about, I mean, like who is a member of the body politic, who can properly bear citizenship in the nation, you know, even like stories about like, what is the ultimate nature of reality? It's like, how could a man be a woman or a woman be a man? My head's breaking. You know, it's like, these are the kinds of stories that I think have really deep resonance right now. And if they're well told, they're going to find their audience.
I also think that it helps trans films, trans cinema getting a wider audience. I think streaming services have helped because they have more options now. They don't have to pay extra money to go to a movie, a theater, to see something that they didn't think they might be interested in, but they are interested in. And I think there's a lot more visibility for trans people and trans stories in streaming platforms right now. So I think that has helped.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that people are very curious about the trans experience right now, and that, you know, it's crucial that we kind of seize the moment. I do think that there is sometimes avoidance also as well, in seeing one's experience represented on screen or something close to it, that sometimes folks have an aversion to that. So yeah, it's an interesting space to mine. I was talking to one of my best girlfriends, one of my sisters, who visited me on the Transparent set, you know, years ago. You know, she was very close to the experience, and then I remember asking her last year and realizing that she had never watched the show, and she confided in me that she doesn't like to watch trans stories. That there's something that like irks her, is disturbing, or activates her gender dysphoria. And she was only telling me that because we're so close, and it was clearly something that she was very self-conscious about. So I think that there is sometimes an innate feeling of being irked, you know, like and then at the same time, there, like, I want to see everything that has a trans character or a trans actor in it, and I'm just much more inclined to, I think, more positive analysis. I'm not a critic. I'm not a very critical person. You know, when people want notes on something, I'm usually like, I'm not that critical. Like, I kind of like things. I kind of tend to look towards the, you know, I'll talk about the things that I like, you know. Those are the things that I notice.
Yeah. You know, Michael, like you're saying earlier that, you know, so many different flavors of trans. It's like, I do think that can get in the way sometimes if you're a trans person of whatever flavor looking for representation. You're like, I want to see somebody like me on screen. I want to feel affirmed by that. And what you get is a different flavor of trans. It can just kind of throw you right out of the experience, you know, like, you know, like I am somebody who has never been in the gay drag world, you know, nor was I somebody who came out of like a heterosexual cross-dressing world, you know. It's kind of like, I always sort of felt like I was a trans lesbian, and I just kind of like kept it on the down low until I transitioned and like moved into a trans life and a queer world in a way that had nothing to do with either cross-dressing or drag. And I just don't see those stories about myself on the screen, you know? And so like, I'm always like watching trans representation, going like, yeah, that's not me. But then like Zachary, it's like, well, I'm just curious. It's like, I'm really open to seeing representation of a lot of different kinds of trans life. It broadens my own sense of what trans can be, but very rarely do I see something that says like, yeah, that was my experience. That actually the time that happened most recently is I watched the special 2-part Christmas episode of Euphoria that came like in like late 2019 or late 2020, early 2021. And I thought that scene with Jules, played by you know, Hunter Schafer, it's like in the psychotherapy office where she's talking about what it felt like to be like swimming in the ocean and moving in darkness. I mean, like, that is like the only episode. I started crying, but like, that was so my experience, you know. And it's just like, it's such a rare feeling, you know, to have. But it's like, I don't think you have to watch representation to see yourself. You could watch representation to like learn about difference. So.
My follow-up question, now that we're talking about trans representation and visibility, I think I read somewhere, heard somewhere that there's also a downside from people knowing more about the trans community. Like there's a correlation between more knowledge about the trans community and violence against trans people. I mean, there's always all kinds of violence against trans people, but it feels like it's more heightened now that the mainstream people are more aware of who the trans people are and what they are about. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, just to quickly, yeah, I think Miss Major was like one of like the legendary foremothers in the trans community, was an actual Stonewall veteran, and you know that she put a real fine point on it. She said, you know, like that she was calling out how much violence is directed at trans women of color in particular. And, you know, she says, so like you see Laverne Cox on the cover of Time magazine, or in Orange is the New Black, or you see Janet Mock, or you see Pose, and maybe it like pisses off the transphobes, but they're not going to get to Janet or Laverne. They're going to get to the person who's standing on the street corner looking for a date, you know, and that's the person who's going to like catch the violence. And so, yeah, a direct correlation between heightened levels of visibility for the most privileged and increased levels of violence for the most vulnerable. Yeah.
I wanted to add, and I don't want to go too much back in history, but just what you mentioned, I thought, because I've heard you speak about Christine Jorgensen in the past, in 1952. Was it a missed opportunity to have better representation of trans people when there's a lot of attention to her, but she also represented someone that has access to drugs or surgery, and you know, all the clothes that she's wearing, she could be glamorous, and maybe that's what the mainstream audience was looking for. But then what was left behind are those people that don't have access to that you know, they do the best they can to represent themselves, especially people of color.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, yeah, Jorgensen was white, and she came from a like working class, you know, lower middle class family. She worked really hard to get access to medical services that were not in fact widely available to anybody, you know, so it's like she had to figure some stuff out to get that. It wasn't just handed to her. But yeah, you're totally right. And, you know, I think in saying that she was given a kind of visibility because of the way she could embody dominant cultural notions of, you know, feminine beauty that were, you know, assumed to be white, and that there were plenty of other trans women of color, people who wanted the same thing Jorgensen got that they weren't able to get for themselves, who, you know, haven't received the same kind of focus, you know, and attention that Jorgensen got. You know, I don't think that she was necessarily, she didn't set out to be a spectacle, you know, but it's like she was spectacularized, and I do think that she kind of walked a really difficult path in the public spotlight with as much grace as she could muster. You know, she certainly performed a kind of trans respectability at a time when it was just considered really, really freaky. So, you know, that was, you know, I admire her for like doing what it seemed possible for her to do, while, you know, still at the same time saying like, yeah, you know, hashtag Jorgensen so white, and took up a lot of space in the available space for trans representation. She took up a lot of it.
Without moving forward the community, I think is the problem.
I think she did move communities
Okay.
forward, you know. I think she did. I mean, and I don't want to say too much more because I feel like Zachary needs to say some things. I've been talking a lot, but yeah, maybe we can circle back around later.
Well, you want my take on Christine Jorgensen? I don't know. As informed a take on as Susan Stryker. I mean, it's yeah. I don't know. I think I think the question of visibility is a very layered one, and that our nose is up against the wall in any particular moment, and that time offers us like the distance to see things more clearly, and to really understand the full impact of this era of trans representation. I think only once we're farther down the road will we understand the real world impacts that it has had. You know, violence against trans people and trans people of color has been persistent throughout history. And it's certainly escalated, I think, in the past decade, as we've gained kind of cultural legitimacy and greater visibility in our communities. I think it's, you know, so crucial that we just supplement the work that we do in culture with supporting nonprofits that provide direct services to folks who are disadvantaged and kind of boots on the ground. And yeah, I know we're running out of time.
Yeah,
but
Nick, do you have some? I forgot what I was going to say, but did you have a question?
Yeah, well, we are running close to out of time here, but there was a question that came in from an attendee. But Michael, if you have something that you wanted to get to quickly, then we can hop to this question, which I think will wrap things up nicely.
The one statistic that I was not aware of, and you probably touched on it, Zachary, earlier, that a GLAAD statistic says that 80% of cisgenders or straight people claim that they don't know any trans person. And I think that might be a lower number if they really know who the trans people in their circle is, because there's some people that choose to live a stealth life. But I thought it was a high number for people not knowing any trans person. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a high number, and you know, it's astounding that 80% of the general population only knows what they see in media. I think it just, you know, further highlights what kind of responsibility it is to create representation, and yeah, knowing that it's many people's only way in, their only access to this community. Susan, what do you think?
You know, I think if you define transgender narrowly as like used to be an X, now a Y, you know, that it seems like the best estimates for people like that in our society is about 0.5%. So at some level, it doesn't surprise me, you know, that you know, given how much ostracization or stigma or rejection there is of trans people, and how a lot of trans people tend to clump together to have each other's backs, that it could be a really, yeah, that most people could claim they don't know a trans person. But, you know, I also think that there can be other ways of framing the question. If you think about trans as a kind of like any sort of expression of gender diversity that crosses over society's usual ways of organizing people into man-woman categories. Transness is really big and present, and everybody like has a, you know, foot in that somehow, you know, like Zachary was saying earlier, it's like there's a way that you could say, well, like, well, everybody varies from gender norms because nobody is a perfect cookie cutter stereotype of, you know, masculinity or femininity. And if you think about trans that way, it's like, well, you know, it's just something that is shot through the entire fabric of society. And then the work of education, you know, whether that's through entertainment or whether it's through teaching in a classroom, can be like helping people reframe what they understand the trans experience to be, you know, to maybe think of it in non-identitarian terms, to like think of everybody as like being on a gender spectrum somehow, and some people just do it one way and some people do it another. And so when I think about that 80% statistic that way, you know, I would agree with Zachary and say, like, yeah, like there's a tremendous responsibility that happens in media work that has a big, huge platform for being able to shift what the conversation about trans is. And it's, you know, it's exciting to be part of doing that work. You know, I say, like, guy, you know, why it's like nothing wrong with teaching 20 people in a seminar, but like, why not teach 20 million people when they like watch something on Netflix? You know, like that's really exciting to be able to do that.
I think that that's a really good segue into the last question that came in for both Susan and Zachary. Could you share your thoughts about the impact of projects like To Survive on This Shore?
Oh my God, I love Jess's work thoroughly. And I think To Survive on This Shore is a living testament to the incredible resilience and perseverance of gender expansive people through time. I think that you can't argue with the existence of real people. I mean, it's very easy to kind of, I think, for the right to pretend that like trans and non-binary people are just this coastal like creation, or you know, that it just happens in Hollywood, but that, you know, the real lived experience of people all over the country it's a powerful message in and of itself.
Yeah, I'll second all of that and say the thing I really appreciated in it was seeing older trans people, sort of being an older trans myself these days. You know, that it's not, you know, it's like, it's not, trans isn't just like, yeah, something that, you know, 20 somethings at, you know, overpriced liberal arts colleges do, you know. It's like, it's something that is persistent. It has a history, it has a presence. People do survive. We don't all like commit suicide or get killed by transphobes. It's like there is survival, resilience, thriving. You know, it was just beautiful. Jess, I know you're in the meeting here at the Zoom today. It's like those are just really beautiful photographs of people who are yeah, you just see their strength and their beauty, and you know, that's really you know, that's really important to see. So thank you for doing that, and thank you, Eastman, you know, Museum, for hosting the show.
Yeah, of course, we're excited to have it, and it's now been open for only 4 or 5 days now, and we're getting a lot of people coming through and having a lot of great comments about it. So if you are in the Rochester area, would love for you to stop by. Well, Susan and Zachary, if you're in the Rochester area, would love for you to stop by and come see the show and say hello to all the attendees. Please do the same. We are open and welcoming everyone to come. So Susan, Zachary, and Michael, thank you all so much for spending this time with us. I was saying yesterday, I was like, yeah, these things usually go about an hour. We went pretty over an hour, but I think that the conversation was definitely strong enough to hold all of our attentions and very worthwhile. I would like to give the last words to our panelists or our moderator, if you have anything you'd like to say.
I do have to say that as a film programmer, I'm exposed to a lot more content when it comes to trans films, because the rest of the world seems to be ahead of us here in the US. They're making a lot more films that are not necessarily about coming out or transitioning um, or surgery and all that stuff. But they hardly make the mainstream cinema. They don't even make it to Netflix most times. So I would just put the word out there to support your local film festivals wherever you are. And if you're here in Rochester, definitely check us out at ImageOut. We always happen in October. And we now introduced our spring edition that happens in May. And heartfelt thank you to both Susan and Zachary for such a wonderful conversation this evening.
Thank you so much for having us. It was just
Pleasure to be here. Zachary, always good to see you. So
glorious seeing you, darling.
Thank you, everybody. We are hoping that out of this conversation, we will be able to do a film series potentially later in the year that will not compete with ImageOut. We'll do something. We'll do something with Michael that is really kind of inspired from this conversation. We'll kind of look back at it and think about what were the topics, what were some of the various talking points, and how can those be explored through films. So keep an eye out for that sometime this fall and early winter. And thank you all again. Have a nice evening and hope everyone has a good rest of their week.
all right.
Bye, everyone.